Good afternoon and welcome everyone. And we are happy to open and start this first of our working group 5 seminars, which we hope to continue until the end of the grant period 2. It is our pleasure to give the floor of today's meeting to our 4 members and today's speakers, Onorina Botezat from Romania, Olga Michael from Cyprus, Michaela I'm sorry, I forgot how to pronounce it. I just...
That's okay, Olga, it's Michaela Peksova.
Peksova, thank you very much, from Czech Republic, and Beata Sosnowska from Poland. My name is Olga Nowak, and together with José Rovira Collado, we are coordinators of the Working Group 5. José Rovira will be responsible today mostly for the technological issues, and I will be moderating the meeting. Since this time we have no guests from other working groups, then we decided to exceed the time limit of your speeches from 15 to 20 minutes without any problems. And I will introduce each of our guests before they start to speak. And after all presentations, we will open a discussion. So you will be able to ask questions, discuss with our guests, and maybe our guests will also have the opportunity to extend their presentations and talk about them a little bit more. But we start with 20 minutes. We will close the meeting at 7 p.m., but maybe sooner, we'll see. And our first speaker of today is Onorina Botezat, and I would like to introduce her. Onorina works at Dimitrie Cantemir Christian University, Bucharest in Romania. She's a director of the Center of Linguistic and Intercultural Research and associate professor, PhD, at the Faculty of Foreign Languages and Literatures. She's also an editor-in-chief of the Annals of Dimitrie Cantemir Christian University Linguistic Literature and Methodology of Teaching, and reviewer for many international journals. Her main fields of interest and research are imagological, literary and cultural studies, visual cultures, and legal terminology. Her last books are Mapping Cultural Identities and Intersections, Imagological Readings, and écrivain roumain d'expression étrangère in the Romanian authors writing in foreign tongues. It's her publication from the year 2021. So, Onorina, whenever you're ready, we can start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga, for this presentation, and thank you for having me here. My topic okay, is it full screen now?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
We forgot you couldn't see us. Yes,
thank you. My topic is bringing comics to the classroom, in the case of literary classics. And I would like to start by saying that nowadays, probably more than ever, visuals are all around. And this helps. For one thing, it helps a lot to introduce them easier into the classroom. And most importantly, it serves a greater purpose to take students a step forward towards literature, instruct them digital skills, and help them better understand the digital environment they find themselves in 24/7 mostly. So from my point of view, it is a win-win scenario where both teachers and students use a tool they like and enjoy, enhancing critical thinking, appealing to a modern design, and, if I may, in plain language, get the job done. As literature mirrors human experience itself, visual culture, stereotypes, any artistic expression is sourced in the human life. Like authors share their fiction through books, artists do that by means of visuals, and the rest of us, we share everything we find catching. So we may say that the modern world has offered us a modern digital tool to do what we are doing from early ages, sharing our story. And every story has layers of formation. A piece of news in a journal or a newspaper or movie, a TV news report, a proverb, a story we hear, everything impacts us and build up our knowledgeable suitcase that we later use to interpret everything we read or see. When we hear nowadays the term visual text, we may immediately think of its expression in the digital age. But the roots of visual texts stretch deep into our history. However, today there are so many more forms of visual text to consider. So to say, from caves, walls to computer screens and all points in between, we are exposed to photographs, TV, videos, video games, political cartoons, posters, social network, etc., etc. And in this age of internet especially, we are constantly overwhelmed with images, both static and moving. And it is more essential than ever that we develop the necessary visual skills in our students to navigate this image intense world we all inhabit. And speaking about current times, those of us who follow the European Commission couldn't help but notice the image the Commission chose to broadcast by illustrator Nina Jivulska, based in Ukraine, that has been drawing this beautiful and handbrake illustration and making them available for any project in support of Ukraine. Today, we attach to them a precise context, but in time, it may for sure grow into a comics or graphic novels that will narrate the horrible events that we are all witnessing. I captured 2 screenshots from the illustrator's Instagram account to show how quickly the storyline and colors changed. We have seen so many times in history that each flow of migration of population brought along new culture, new narrative plots, and for each historical period, we have a dedicated literature. And it translates into text or illustration the history of humankind. Comics were perceived for a long time as an entertainment tool for young readers, and as such, comic book adaptation of literary classics was regarded as small literature that aimed to accommodate beginners that were not able to read the original novel. What we witness nowadays is that comics acquired itself the role of important tool in studying images and texts. Likewise, it also provides proves to be a great vehicle to transmit to the young generation the literary culture based on works included in the literary heritage of each nation. The first advantage of adaptation of an existing literary work to comics is the perfect framework to analyze 2 distinguished modes of narration. This helps to improve critical thinking and observe how the same story may be told in different ways. Adaptations of classic literary works provide this opportunity, understanding how the same writing may be conveyed to the reader through different means. The adaptation appeared in the 40s with the series Classic Illustrated, published by Gilbert & Company in the US. And the first issue was the adaptation of Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. And there are over 200 of these adaptations digitally scanned at the Internet Archive, available online, and they represent the artifact of the golden age and ancestors of our current explosion of graphic novels and comics adaptation of classic literature. In France as well, we find in the 50s early adaptation of classics that proved to be very respectful of the original text, as the cartoonist very often inserted big passages from the original text. Little by little, cartoonists distance themselves from the original and translate into images their own personal understanding of great novels, such as Ivanhoe, published in 1982 by Les Humanoïdes Associés, imagined by Dino Battaglia. The adaptations later became truly free, and sometimes cartoonists propose new reinterpretation. The last image on this slide is a 2013 adaptation of one of most beloved books for kids in Romania, originally published in the late 19th century, 1892, and I will discuss it in more details shortly. So apart from the first earlier mentioned advantage, that of analyzing two distinct modes of narration, comics may very well serve as an introduction to reading the original novel. Discovering certain adaptations, students may indeed be led to take an interest in the original text. Here, of course, there is the pedagogical debate whether we should follow the traditional path and use the original text to teach literature in order to study and analyze the literary work, or maybe we should adapt to the level of our students and to understand the current trend of visual narratives and them overlapping in a very interdisciplinary way. Another important element to consider is the target group. Comic book adaptation of classic writings are perfectly suitable for young readers that discover great pieces of literature in their mother tongues at early age, and for students enrolled in foreign languages programs that are not yet equipped to read the original, and an adaptation may better suit their language level. When proposed comics instead of large fragments of the original text, students are able to take their first step towards an autonomous reading in a foreign language, which in time will help both their ability to read and, most importantly, their desire to read. Not to mention the impact of images on demotivated students. Adapted to their level of language, it increases the reading comprehension, and once the vocabulary barrier is overcome, other objectives may be achieved. A modern literary translation into images can also offer us a didactic tool to talk about cohesion and progression, see how images transpose the text and make use of intertextuality to discover how images translate the text, but also how they create content. By means of comics, students may identify the various techniques of storytelling, characterization, point of views, and, of course, great themes. It may help imagining the world and understand the particularities of an epoch, of a place, or a character, understand better some characters' behaviors and values, compare the effects produced by a novel and its visual rendering, and understand the place of certain general myths and tales in the cultural heritage of a language. Graphic adaptations therefore prove to be helpful to decode cultural and socio-historical context in a literary text and facilitate developing visual literacy. Without changing the words themselves much, a graphic novelization can enable readers to connect statements more easily with characters, gain a sense of setting, and follow the action of the story. That in turn can aid them in cutting through the previous century's jargon to discern what the characters are truly saying. Here is an example from manga classic 2019, The Count of Monte Cristo, by Stacey King, adapter, Nokman Poon, illustrator, and Crystal Chen, contributor, based, of course, on Alexandre Dumas novel. So a work of literature has a huge number of words that exposes the reader to different types of registers used in different workplaces. And compared to the original text, in which the language is strictly connected to the socio-historic period, an adaptation written, let's say, in level A2 or B1, so where the words and phrasing is clearer and words are more familiar, is more convenient for beginners. When referring to adult learners of foreign languages, comic adaptation of a classic is more manageable for students to read for many reasons. It is shorter. It is true. So there is no anxiety and surprise faces when they see huge printed books. The vocabulary does not impose any problems. Thus, the students improve self-confidence and are willing to read more. It is easier for students to relate to a text when they can see it, so it becomes more relevant. It captures student interest in this increasingly visual world, which then also increases students' motivation and desire to keep reading because they can be successful at it, therefore promoting a positive association to reading, which is very important. Structured into separate chapters and written over several years, from 1881 to 1888. Childhood Memories, these short stories are called like that. Johan Kranga's masterpiece includes some of the most recognizable samples of first-person narratives in Romanian literature. It is studied for different purposes at all levels in school. As it was written in the late 19th century, the language has a lot of archaism and regionalism for the overlived-in Principality of Moldova. So for primary school level, the language of the original text poses a lot of text comprehension difficulties, while the comic, as the example you can see, this comic adaptation uses plain language and focuses on the main plot, enchanting kids' view and engaging young audience to discover the masterpiece of the Romanian literature. And you can see that there are different colors of the balloons. So the balloons in white with the adapted text, and those in yellow keep the original words and phrasing from the original text. As it happens in many literary classics, in time, they leave traces on the vocabulary, and famous expressions retrieved from them are used in our daily vocabulary of native users. So those who adapted the short story to the script seemed to highlight that. In comparison,
sorry, and Onorina is only telling you have about 5 minutes more.
Yes, I'm finishing. I have only 2 slides. So in comparison, there are also comics adaptation that follow the original text, like these 2 examples from Romeo and Juliet, that are not in modern English, nor in a plain language. They follow strictly the original. What I like the most about this comics album is that it also introduces to young readers the author, as memories are stories written in the first person. So having a face attached to a name that young students learn in primary school, they may learn better the story and see how the story telling of a first person is constructed. So all in all, I would say that there are more advantages for using visuals in a literary in a class of literature, and I haven't found any disadvantages. So on the bright side, all this visual world that we are living in helps us a lot to improve our skills. And thank you. I'm done.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your self-discipline. I'm so sorry I interrupted, but we have no clock here to show all of
I
you
read
the
it
time
before
is
I knew that I was
okay, I hope you don't mind, but thank you so much for this fantastic journey through the world of the adaptations. And I'm sure we all have some questions for you later on. So thank you once again. And our next speaker of today will be just looking for Olga. Olga Michael. I will introduce you. Olga Michael is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of English University in Cyprus. She's currently working on the completion of 2 monographs under contract with Bloomsbury Academic. And these are Human Rights in Graphic Life Narrative and Migrant Stories and the New European Literary Canon, co-authored with Nelson Gonzalez Ortega. She's interested in representations of border crossings, human rights, trauma, and gendered violence in graphic life narratives. Her forthcoming publications include looking at the perpetrator in Nina Banjevac's graphic memoir, Fatherland, a journal of perpetrator research. And her most recent publications include Queering the Family, Reclaiming the Father, Proustian Evocations, and Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. And her today speech is titled The Fairy Tale of Europe's Refugee Crisis in Graphic Narratives for Children and Young. Whenever you're ready, Olga.
Okay, let me try to share again. Okay, let me know if you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can. If you can click the slideshow. Oh, it's perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Olga.
Okay, thank you. I will start the presentation now. So this is drawn from a section of the book I am co-authoring on migrant stories and the new European literary canon. It is taken from the chapter titled The Fairy Tale of Europe's Refugee Crisis in Graphic Narratives for Children and Young Adults. And I will discuss Francesca Sana's The Journey, which was published in 2016. Sana explains that the book started with a story of two girls she met in a refugee center in Italy. After collecting more personal narratives of migration, she composed this graphic narrative, which she describes as a collage of all those personal stories and incredible strength of the people within them. In what follows, I look into the educational potential of this book in regard to its depiction of Europe's refugee and migration crisis for younger readers. Evgenia Sifagi introduces the term children's refugee literature to refer to texts that illustrate the causes leading to and the conditions in which refugee and migrant movement and resettlement occur. This type of literature, she continues, aims to raise child readers' awareness on this pressing matter, and to educate them about human rights. Sifaki stresses the importance of supplementing such narratives because in the case of Greece, for example, they typically focus on the refugee experience and do not attempt to produce knowledge about the diverse cultures from which refugee children contemporarily residing in Greece come. Referring to the academic turn to the literary representations of Europe's refugee crisis for children, Vasiliki Vasiloudi argues that despite the plurality of academic as well as other voices engaging with such narratives, one should not fail to acknowledge that a lot of scholarly work understands them as an opportunity to educate non-refugee children into engaging in acts of humanity rather than urging them to unearth the roots of the refugee crisis. Important issues, she continues, are muted if addressed at all. Such issues concern the hostile reception often faced by refugees after they reach host countries, the refusal of entrance to certain countries, the building of fences and barriers to seal borders, the appalling living conditions in refugee camps, and the desperate plights faced by refugee children struggling to come to grips with their new condition that includes homelessness, loss of family, loss of their homeland and identity, lack of safety, and exploitation. The happy ending, which is also a distinct fairy tale trait that prevails in the samples of children's refugee literature Vasiloudi examines in her essay, is also problematic for her. As she explains, happy closure, which for some prevents the risk of insidiously traumatizing Western child readers, constitutes a trap that a considerable number of picture books fall into when glossing over the insurmountable difficulties encountered by refugees in a host country. Vasiloudi further notes that choosing to familiarize children with such reading material, we, as adults, academics, parents, educators, and critics, should ask ourselves in whose best interest we act by promoting distorted images of rapturous acceptance and benevolence. Even if non-refugee child readers are our primary focus, how are we benefiting them by giving them half-truths and watered-down stories, she asks. What kind of education are we seeking for our children in the West? Should our proposed pedagogy exhaust itself in effective investments, avoiding politicization in spite of the fact that the issue explored is hardly apolitical, she further wonders. So while I share both Sifagi and Vasiloudi's view that it is necessary to note what remains outside the frame of representation in children's refugee literature, my analysis of the journey aims to highlight the usefulness of stylistic and narratological analysis for unveiling nuanced graphic displays of Europe's so-called refugee crisis that can unsettle the stereotypical understandings of the non-European female refugee as an abject victim, for example, and of the European host as an ethically elevated humanitarian savior. Through this presentation, I hope to demonstrate a more optimistic take on children's refugee literature than the one introduced by Vasiloudi, which highlights the value of the journey, in particular in reading contexts in the European classroom and beyond. So the journey introduces the border crossing taken by a mother and her two children upon the start of the war and the death of her husband. The narrative starts with the family spending their time near the sea, which ominously foreshadows the arrival of the war through its black color that gradually dominates the space of the page, transforming later into a monstrous existence. The bright colors of the seaside, where the family spends its holiday, become visually juxtaposed with the approaching darkness of the sea. This marine depiction may imply that the causes of the war came from outside, silently pointing to external involvement, at the same time as evoking the sea's lethal function for asylum seekers and refugees. The father's death during the war and the family's rupture are visually depicted through the dark, monstrous hands that take over the narrative's pages, leaving no space for the family itself, nor for the city they inhabit to exist. The city eventually becomes destroyed, and the mother decides to flee with her children to a safer place. Her long hair, as you will see in a little bit, is often drawn as protective cape in which she securely holds both of her children. We don't want to leave, the narrator mentions, but our mother tells us that it will be a great adventure. For Vasiludi, the characterization of the family's border-crossing journey as an adventure constitutes an example of how children's refugee literature can portray the displacement suffered by underprivileged children in the East as a sugar-coated, risk-free journey. This description, nevertheless, of the border-crossing journey as an adventure can also be read as the mother's attempt to protect her children in the diegetic realm, where the obstacles the family has to face upon arriving in the West are also displayed. So borders, massive walls, barbed wire, prolonged dangers, traveling in the back of lorries, bad weather conditions, smugglers, and border guards all visually embody the hardships the family has to overcome. Animals become personified throughout the narrative to accompany the family and to shelter them as they cross different forests. Donald Hasse describes the woods as emblematic fairy tale spaces that otherwise threaten characters with isolation, danger, and violence, including imprisonment and death. In the journey, however, they seem to constitute a space of relative security and refuge. To the contrary, it is when the family reaches western borders that threat becomes visually embodied. We finally arrive at the border, the child narrator says. It is an enormous wall and we must climb over it. At this instance, the perspective readers have is distant from the border itself, and the mother and the two children are hardly visible on the bottom side of the page, visually evoking their powerlessness against Western deterrence policies. On the next page, which you can see here in the presentation, the family is again drawn as significantly small when encountering a monstrous giant border guard whose presence dominates the page and who emerges from behind the border wall. You're not allowed to cross the border. You should go back. The guard shouts at them. And the child narrator also mentions that they have nowhere to go. The guard's skin color, and the orange color of his beard and hair may be interpreted as visually marking his difference from the family. In accounting for how heroes overcome monsters in various fairy tales and myths, Christopher Booker explains that this creature can be embodied through a human, an animal, or a mixture of the two. Referring to one of the definitions of the monster in the Oxford English Dictionary, he points out that it can be a person of inhuman and horrible cruelty or wickedness, and that when its guardianship is in any way challenged, the monster lashes out viciously, steering from its lair bent on pursuit and revenge. In this sense, alongside his aggressive look and size, sharp teeth, and terrifying hands, the guard's rage in the family's attempt to challenge his guardianship visually embodies the monstrosity of the European border control policies through a visual metaphor. When the family finds refuge in the forest, the narrator explains that he or she is afraid of the darkness and the noises. But that mother is with us and she's never scared. We close our eyes and we finally fall asleep. In both cases, the mother's long hair visually mediates how she protects her children. Furthermore, that she's drawn crying as they sleep shows how she carefully hides her fear from them, as she also does when naming the journey an adventure. After traveling through mountains and forests, the family boards a ferry with other people to cross the sea. There is not much space, and it rains every day, the child narrator relates, but we tell each other stories, tales of terrible and dangerous monsters that hide beneath our boats, ready to gobble us up if the boat capsizes. In the visual realm of the narrative, nevertheless, the fish and the cephalopods that live beneath the sea and are shown are depicted as neither threatening nor monstrous, in juxtaposition with the human border guards we come across in the narrative. In fact, their cartoony depictions introduce them as friendly as opposed to monstrous. At the end, the narrator draws parallels between their family's journey and that of the birds which accompany them without nevertheless having to cross any borders. This narrative fragment thus implicitly points to the human responsibilities in rendering the journey of this family excessively precarious by silently reminding us that the monstrosity of the border is man-made. At the same time, by introducing the refugee mother as a resilient hero, the journey refrains from placing her in the position of the refugee victim in need for a Western male savior. Given that comics as a medium is traditionally linked to Western superheroes such as Superman or the Wonder Woman, it is important to note how the journey narratively recasts heroism as embodied by real people, refugees and asylum seekers, whose lives are marked by excessive precarity cast upon them by the monster of European border control policies. So through this short analysis, I hope to have shed light on the usefulness of this text in reading context in the European classroom and beyond. For Zervou, the differences between adult and children's refugee literatures lie in that in the former case, harsh realistic scenes do not constitute a problem, and that educational censorship does not typically occur. The task at hand for the authors of children's refugee literature, she continues, is to account for this difficult reality with honesty and without excessively beautifying it. Through the examination of the fairy tale aspects of the journey, such as monsters, forests, the fairy tale protagonist and hero, I hope to have pointed out to what Katrina McLeod has described as some of the possibilities that may be exploited in the politicization of a visual medium, which particularly speaks to a young demographic that is exposed incessantly to the homogenizing voice of media and other public discourse. And this is the end of my presentation. Okay, just to, before I finish completely, just to connect my presentation with what Onorina said before, this is a text that can also be used in language learning. You can teach tenses, you can teach metaphors, you can teach plot development in English, and also if you have a look at a common European framework for language learning, they have the updated version, has additional scales on mediation and intercultural communication, where and comics are referred to a lot in terms of communicating different cultural traits and overcoming cultural barriers, etc. And so texts like this, I think, can be used in language learning as well. That's it from me.
Thank you very much. That was really very interesting and beautiful picture book you shared with us, and you talked about it. Yeah, I'm sure we'll have more questions later on. Thank you very much, Olga.